Salman Rushdie doing Quixote. Now let's do Jorge Luis Borges with Prr Mnrd, author of Don Quixote. The viable work left by this novelist is easily and briefly enumerated. Imponderable, therefore, are the omissions and additions perpetrated by Madame Henri Bachelier in a fallacious catalogue with a certain daily whose Protestant tendency is no secret, has had the inconsideration to inflict upon its deplorable readers, though these be few and Calvinist, if not Masonic and circumcised. The true friends of Mnrd have viewed this catalogue with alarm, and even with a certain melancholy. One might say that only yesterday we gathered before his final monument amidst the lugubrious cypress, and already errors tries to tarnish his memory. Decidedly, a brief rectification is unavoidable. I am aware that it is quite easy to challenge my slight authority. I hope, however, that it shall not be prohibited from mentioning two eminent testimonies. The Baroness de Bachort, at whose unforgettable Vendrées I had the honor of meeting the lamented poet, has seen fit to approve the pages which follow. The Countess de Beauharnais-Guiot, one of the most delicate spirits of the Principality of Monaco, and now of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, following her recent marriage to the international philanthropist Simon Katsucich, who has been so inconsiderably slandered, alas, by the victims of his disinterested maneuvers, has sacrificed to veracity and to death, such were her words, the stately reserve which is her distinction, and in an open letter published in the magazine Lux, concedes me her approval as well. These authorizations, I think, are not entirely insufficient. I have said that Mnrd's visible work can be easily enumerated. Having examined with care his personal files, I find that they contain the following items. A symbolist sonnet, which appears twice, with variants, in the review Leconque, issues March and October 1899. B. A monograph on the possibilities of constructing a poetic vocabulary of concepts which would not be synonyms or paraphrases of those which make up our everyday language, but rather ideal objects created according to convention and essentially designed to satisfy poetic needs. Nimes, 1901. C. A monograph on certain connections or affinities between the thoughts of Descartes, Leibniz, and John Wilkes. Nimes, 1903. D. A monograph on Leibniz's Characteristica Universala. Nimes, 1904. E. A technical article on the possibility of improving the game of chess, eliminating one of the rook's pawns. Mnrd proposes, recommends, discusses, and finally rejects this innovation. F. A monograph on Raymond Lully's Ars Magnus Generalis, Nimes, 1906. G. A translation, with prologue and notes, of Ruy López de Suraglo's Libro de la Invención Libro y Arte de Jrg Ls Brgs, Paris, 1907. H. The worksheets of a monograph on George Boole's symbolic logic. I. An examination of the essential metric laws of French prose, illustrated with examples taken from Saint Simon. Revues des langues romances, Montpellier, October 1909. J. A reply to Luc Dutain, who has denied the existence of such laws, illustrated with examples from Luc Durain. Revenues des langues romances, Montpellier, December 1909. K. A manuscript translation of the Agua de Navios Cultos of Cuevo, entitled La Boussole de la Pursuit. L. A preface to the catalogue of an exposition of lithographs by Carlos Roucaide, Nimes, 1914. M. The work Les Problèmes d'un Problème, Paris, 1917, which discusses in chronological order the different solutions given to the illustrious problems of Achilles and the tortoise. 2 editions of this book have appeared so far. The second bears an epigraph, Leibniz's recommendation, Ne créez point Monsieur le Torteur, and revises the chapters dedicated to Russell's Descartes. N. A determined analysis of the synaptic customs of Toilette, N.R.F., March 1921. Mnrd, I recall, declared that censure and praise are sentimental operations which have nothing to do with literary criticism. O. A transposition into Alexandria's of Paul Verlaine's Le Semestre Marin, N.R.F., January 1928. P. An invective against Paul Vallier in the paper for the suppression of reality of Jacques Ribot. This invective, we might say, parenthetically, is exact opposite of his true opinion of Vallier. The latter understood it as such, and their old friendship was not endangered. Q. A definition of the Countess of Bagnero in the victorious volume. The location is Gabriel Annunzia's, another of its collaborators, published annually by this lady to rectify the inevitable falsification of journalists and to present to the world and to Italy an authentic image of her person, so often exposed by the very reason of her beauty, and her activities to erroneous or hasty interpretations. R. A cycle of admirable sonnets for the Baron de Balcourt, 1934. S. A manuscript list of verses which owe their efficiency to their punctuation. Note 1. Madame Henri Barquier also lists a literal translation of Cuevo's translation of the Introduction à la vie dévote of Saint Francis of Sales. There are no traces of such a work in Mnrd's library. It must have been a jest of our friend, misunderstood by the lady. This, back to the main text, this then is the visible work of Mnrd, in chronological order, with no omission other than a few vague sonnets of circumstance written for the hospitable or avid album of Madame Henri Bachelard. I turn now to his other work, the subterranean and interminably heroic, the peerless, and, such are the capacities of man, the unfinished. This work, perhaps the most significant of our time, consists of the 9th and 38th chapters of the first part of Don Quixote, and a fragment of chapter 22. I know such an affirmation seems an absurdity. To justify this absurdity is the primordial object of this note. See note 2. I also had the secondary intention of sketching a personal portrait of Prr Mnrd, but how could I dare to compete with the golden pages which, I am told, the Baroness de Balcourt is preparing with the delicate and punctual pencil of Carolus Orcade? Back to the main text. 2 texts of unequal value inspired this undertaking. One is that philological fragment by Novalis, the one numbered 2005 in the Dresden edition, which outlines the theme of total identification with a given author. The other is one of those parasitical books which situate Christ on a boulevard, Hamlet on La Chamblère, or Don Quixote on Wall Street. Like all men of good taste, Mnrd abhorred these useless carnivals, fit only, as he would say, to produce the plebeian pleasures of the anachronistic, or, what's worse, to enthrall us with the elementary idea that all epochs are the same or different. More interesting, though contradictory and superficial of execution, seems to him the famous plan of Daudet to conjoin the ingenuous gentleman and his squire in one figure, which was Tartarien, Those who have insinuated that Mnrd dedicated his life to writing a contemporary Quixote culminate his illustrious memory. He did not want to compose another Quixote, which is easy, but the Quixote itself. Needless to say, he never contemplated a mechanical transcription of the original. He did not propose to copy it. His admirable intention was to produce a few pages that would coincide word for word and line for line with those of Miguel Cervantes. My intention is no more than astonishing, he wrote to me the 30th of September, 1934, from Bayonne. The final term in a theological or metaphysical demonstration, the objective world, God, causality, the forms of the universe, is no less previous and common than my famed novel. The only difference is that the philosophers publish the intermediate stages of their labor in pleasant volumes, and I have resolved to do away with those stages. In truth, not one worksheet remains to bear witness of his years of effort. The first method he conceived was relatively simple: know Spanish well, recover the Catholic faith, fight against the Moors or the Turk, forget the history of Europe between the years 1602 and 1918, be Miguel Cervantes. Prr Mnrd studied this procedure. I know he attained a fairly accurate command of 17th century Spanish, but discarded it as too easy, rather as impossible. My reader will say, granted, but the undertaking was impossible from the very beginning, at least was impossible from the very beginning, and of all the impossible ways of carrying it out, this was the least interesting. To be in the 20th century a popular novelist of the 17th seemed to him a diminution. To be in some ways Cervantes and reach the quote Quixote seemed less arduous to him, and consequently less interesting than to go on being Prr Mnrd and reach the Quixote through the experience of Prr Mnrd. This conviction, we might say in passing, made him omit the autobiographical prologue to the second part of Don Quixote. To include that prologue would have been to create another character, Cervantes, but it would also have meant presenting the Quixote in terms of that character and not Mnrd. Later, the latter naturally declined that facility. My undertaking is not difficult, essentially, I read in another part of his letter. I should only have to be immortal to carry it out. I confess that I often imagined that he did finish it, and that I read the Quixote, all of it, as if Mnrd had conceived of it. Some nights pass while leafing through chapters 26, never essayed by him. I recognize our friend's style, and something of his voice in this exceptional praise, the river nymphs and the dolorous and humid echo. This happy conjunction of a spiritual and physical adjective brought to my mind a verse by Shakespeare which we discussed one afternoon, where a malignant and turbaned Turk... But why precisely the Quixote? Our reader will ask. Such a preference in a Spaniard would not have been inexplicable, but is, no doubt, in a symbolist from Nimes, essentially a devotee of Poe, who engendered Baudelaire, who engendered Mallarmé, who engendered Vallier, who engendered Edmond Teste. The aforementioned letter illuminates the point. The Quixote, clarifies Maynard, interests me deeply, but it does not seem, how shall I say it, inevitable. I cannot imagine the universe without Edgar Allan Poe's exclamation, "Ah, bear in mind this garden was enchanted," or without the Baptiste Ivre or the Bateau Ivre or the Ancient Mariner. But I am quite capable of imagining it without the Quixote. I speak, naturally, of my personal capacity, and not of those works' historical's resonance. The Quixote is a contingent book. The Quixote is unnecessary. I can premeditate writing it. I can write it without falling into tautology. When I was 10 or 12 years old, I read it, perhaps in its entirety. Later, I've reread closely certain chapters, those which I shall not attempt for the time being. I have also gone through the interludes, the plays, the Galetta, the exemplary novels, the undoubtedly laborious tribulations of Persiles and Segamustgunda, and the Vija de Parmasio. My general election of the Quixote, simplified by forgetfulness and difference, can well equal the precise and imprecise and prior image of a book not yet written. Once that image, which no one can legitimately deny me, is postulated, it is certain that my problem is a good bit more difficult than Cervantes was. My obliging predecessor did not refuse the collaboration of chance. He composed his immortal work somewhat à la diable, carried along by the inertia of language and invention. I have taken on the mysterious duty of reconstructing literally his spontaneous work. My solitary game is governed by two polar laws. The first permits me to essay variations of a formal or psychological type. The second obliges me to sacrifice these variations to the original text and reason out this annihilation in an irrefutable manner. To these artificial hindrances another, of a congenial kind, must be added. To compose Quixote at the beginning of the 17th century was a reasonable undertaking, necessary and perhaps even unavoidable. At the beginning of the 20th century, it is almost impossible. It is not in vain that 300 years have gone by, filled with exceedingly complex events. Amongst them, to mention only one, is the Quixote itself. In spite of these obstacles, Mnrd's fragmentary Quixote is more subtle than Cervantes. The latter, in a clumsy fashion, opposes to the fictions of chivalry the tawdry provincial reality of his country. Mnrd selects as his reality the land of Carmen during the century of Lipano and Lope de Vega. What a series of Espagnolas that selection would have suggested to Maurice Barres or Dr. Rodriguez Loretta. Mnrd eludes them with complete naturalness. In his work there are no gypsy flourishes or conquistadors or mystics or Philippe II or Otto de Fe. He neglects or eliminates local color. This disdain points to a new conception of the historical novel. This disdain condemns Salomba with no possibility of appeal. It is no less astonishing to consider isolated chapters. For example, let us examine chapter 38 of the first part, which treats the curious discourse of Don Quixote on arms and letters. It is well known that Don Quixote, like Cuevo, in an analogous and latter passage in La Urs de Todos, decided that debate against letters and in favor of arms. Cervantes was a former soldier. His verdict is understandable, but that Prr Mnrd Don Quixote, a contemporary of La Trazon des Clercs and Bertrand Russell, should fall prey to such a nebulous sophistries. Madame Bachelard has seen here an admirable and typical subordination on the part of the author to the hero's psychology. Others, not at all perspicaciously, a transcription of the Quixote, the Baroness Bachelard, the influence of Nietzsche. To this third interpretation, which I judge to be irrefutable, I am not sure I would dare add a fourth, which concords very well with the almost divine modesty of Prr Mnrd, his resigned or ironical habit of propagating ideas which were the strict reverse of those he preferred. Let us recall once more his diatribe against Paul Valliere and Jacques Ribot's ephemeral surrealist sheet. Cervantes' text and Mnrd's are verbally identical, but the second is almost infinitely richer. More ambiguous, his detractors will say, but ambiguity is richness. It is a revelation to compare Mnrd's Don Quixote with Cervantes. The latter, for example, wrote, Part 1, Chapter 9, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, dispository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. Written in the 17th century, written by the lay genius Cervantes, this enumeration is mere rhetorical praise of history. Mnrd, on the other hand, writes, Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the futural's counselor. History, the mother of truth. The idea is astounding. Mnrd, a contemporary of William James, does not define history as an inquiry into reality, but as its origin. Historical truth for him is not what has happened, it is what we judge to have happened. The final phrase, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future, his counselor, are brazenly pragmatic. The contrast in style is also vivid. The archaic style of Mnrd, quite foreign after all, suffers from a certain affectation. Not so that of his forerunner, who handles with ease the current Spanish of his time. There is no exercise of the intellect which is not, in the final analysis, useless. A philosophical doctrine begins as a plausible description of the universe. With the passage of the years it becomes a mere chapter, if not a paragraph or a name, in the history of philosophy. In literature, this eventual caducity is even more notorious. The Quixote, Mnrd told me, was, above all, an entertaining book. Now it is the occasion for patriotic toasts, grammatical insolence, and obscene deluxe editions. Fame is a form of incomprehension, perhaps the worst. There is nothing new in these nihilistic verifications. What is singular is the determination Mnrd derived from them. He decided to anticipate the vanity awaiting all man's efforts. He set himself to an undertaking which was exceedingly complex and, for the very beginning, futile. He dedicated his scruples and his sleepless nights to repeating an already extant book in an alien tongue. He multiplied draft upon draft, revising tenaciously, and tore up thousands of manuscript pages. Note 1. I remember his quadratic notebooks, his black crossed-out passages, his peculiar typographical symbols, and his insect-like handwriting. In the afternoons he liked to go for a walk around the outskirts of Nimes. He would take his notebook with him and make a merry bonfire. Back to the text. He did not let anyone examine these drafts, and took care that they should not survive him. In vain have I tried to reconstruct them. I have reflected that it is permissible to see in this final Quixote a kind of palmacet, through which the traces, tenuous but not indecipherable, of our friend's previous writings should be translucently visible. Unfortunately, only a second Prr Mnrd, inverting the other's work, would be able to exhume and revive those lost Troys. Thinking, analyzing, inventing, he also wrote to me, are not anomalous acts. They are normal respirations of the intelligence. To glorify the occasional performance of that function, to hoard ancient and alien thoughts, to recall with incredulous stupor that the Doctor Universalis thought, is to confess our laziness and our barbarity. Every man should be capable of all ideas, and I understand that in the future this will be the case. Mnrd, perhaps without wanting to, has enriched by means of a new technique the halting and rudimentary art of reading. This new technique is that of the deliberate anachronism, and the erroneous attribution. This technique, whose applications are infinite, prompts us to go through the Odyssey as if it were posterior to the Aeneid, and the book Le Jardin de Censure of Madame Henri Bachelard as if it were by Madame Henri Bachelard. This technique fills the most placid works with adventure. To attribute the Imitatio Christi to Louis Fernand Céline or to James Joyce, is this not a sufficient renovation of its tenuous spiritual indications? Let me read that last line again. This technique fills the most placid works with adventure. To attribute the Imitato Cristo to Louise Fernand Céline or to James Joyce, is this not a sufficient renovation of its tenuous spiritual inclinations? For Silvano Ocampo, and this is translated by James E. Irby. More videos later.